If you believe in the teachings of Jesus or Buddha or someone like that who wants people to be peaceful and to love each other, that is a good thing.
Yeah, but what's that got to do with the origin of the moon?
Because I don't believe a meteor crashed into the earth and made everything happen. I think intelligent design made everything happen. Give it a last word.
Hello, Bezel 333. That was Professor Richard Dawkins being interviewed by Bill O'Reilly about his book called The Magic of Reality. It's no surprise that Dawkins, who is a figurehead of a new breed of zealous, outspoken, downright belligerent individuals who are extremely intolerant of anyone who believes in a transcendent God or the supernatural events connected to God, would write a book like this.
You may remember about 2 years ago, we had atheist Richard Dawkins on the Factor. He is on a crusade to convince believers they're idiots. Well, now Mr. Dawkins has a new book partially aimed at children called The Magic of Reality. I talked to him earlier this week. You wrote this book, and this book, is marketed somewhat toward children, adolescents, correct?
It is.
Yeah, and you want them to not only believe in science, but reject God and religion.
No, this is a book about science. It doesn't talk about God.
Now, Dawkins is correct to a point here. The book is divided into 12 chapters that tackle different subjects having to do with the natural sciences.
The structure of the book is that each chapter is headed by a question, like what is the sun, what is a rainbow, what is an earthquake.
It mocks God. I looked at it.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah,
Which bit have you looked at?
I mean, I went through that book, and you basically are saying that everything can be explained by science. Correct?
Well, everything about the natural world can be explained by science, but where does it mock God?
It basically says that these things are myths. They're not really true.
Every chapter has myths at the beginning of the chapter.
Aha!
O'Reilly's over-exuberance in thinking he has caught Dawkins in a fib is not called for at this juncture. Dawkins does not blatantly mock God so much as he dismisses any thought of there possibly being a God. That all stories of God and the supernatural events associated with him are simply made-up myths, like the magic of a pumpkin being turned into a coach by a fairy godmother. However, listen to how Dawkins describes the myths that he includes in his book as a juxtaposition to the real truth of how things are.
And each chapter begins with a set of myths. Myths about the sun, myths about the earthquake. Myths from all around the world. Among the myths, in several of the chapters, you'll find the Judeo-Christian myth, not given any special privileged position, but just tucked in there somewhere. So Jesus turning water into wine, for example, the so-called miracle of Fatima, where 3 young children thought they saw the Virgin Mary and told lots of people about it.
Now this is fascinating. Dawkins first purposely downplays the importance of Christianity by saying it's just like any other myth, just tucked in there somewhere, and then gives 2 examples. First, he mentioned Jesus turning water into wine. Indeed, this miracle is recorded in the Gospel of John, who was a disciple of Jesus and therefore was either himself an eyewitness or was able to talk with eyewitnesses about this event. But notice what Dawkins mentions next, the miracle at Fatima. What? There are so many miracles in the Old as well as the New Testament, but what does Dawkins choose to throw in there? A thoroughly Roman Catholic, non-biblical story of the alleged appearance of the Virgin Mary to 3 shepherd children at Fatima, Portugal in 1917. Now this is a common tactic of Dawkins. Find the most extreme, and in this case, an unrelated example of what he is arguing against and treat it as if it were the norm. The Fatima story has nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity, but this disingenuousness does not seem to bother Dawkins in the least. Now, okay, here's an example of how Dawkins begins each chapter.
Chapter 2. Who was the first person? Like most chapters in the book, it's headed by a few myths, and in this case I've got a Tasmanian Aboriginal myth, and a Norse myth, a Valhalla myth of the origin of the first person. All cultures have had origin myths, all cultures have had creation myths, and I've just chosen 3 of them. The third one I chose was the Jewish myth of Genesis, the myth of Adam and Eve. I toss in the Judeo-Christian myth along with the others. There's nothing special about it. It's just a myth like any other.
Now, it's curious and worthy of examination how often Dawkins tries to drive home the point that Christianity is just like any other myth. I think the reason he does this is because it is the one religion whose foundations are undeniably historical and well documented.
And then we come to the meat of the chapter. Who was the first person really? There never was a first person. Because every person had to have parents, and those parents had to be people too. And they had to have parents, and they were people too. There never was a first rabbit, never a first crocodile, never a first dragonfly. Every creature ever born belonged to the same species as its parents. They belonged to the same species as its grandparents, and so on.
No beef with the Bible there, Richard. There are genealogies in both the Old and New Testaments that trace back to Adam. Jesus had no problem with the idea of a first human couple that began the race. In Mark 10, 2-9, we read this. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. And he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." The first man being created by God from his own breath and the dust of the earth may well seem strange to you. But as you will see, Dawkins postulates that if you go back far enough, your first parents were bacteria.
Your 45 million great-grandfather 105 million years ago, something like a shrew or a tree shrew. Your 170 million great-grandmother 310 million years ago, the ancestor of all reptiles and of all mammals and birds. It's been drawn as sort of a bit like a lizard, but we don't know whether it was really like that. Your 175 million great-grandfather 340 million years ago, the common ancestor of modern salamanders, it looks a bit like a salamander, and frogs, and of us. And then, this is where we came in, 417 million years ago, your 185 million great-grandfather, that fish. And of course we don't stop there. The line of picture postcards wends its way on and on into the past. And at some point we start to run out of fossils and they become less and less clear what our ancestors looked like. But it's fairly clear that they would have eventually been single-celled animals, single-celled creatures, more like bacteria perhaps.
What Dawkins is relating as fact is in fact a theory, and a theory is a proposition commonly assumed to be correct. It is a proposed explanation that is based on conjecture rather than actual fact. Former evolutionist R.L. Weissong wrote in his book called The Creation-Evolution Controversy, he said this: "Evolution requires plenty of faith. Faith in L proteins that defy chance formation. A faith in the formation of DNA codes which, if generated spontaneously, would spell only pandemonium. A faith in a primitive environment that in reality would fiendishly devour any chemical precursors to life. Faith in fossils that embarrassingly show fixity through time. Regular absence of transitional forms and striking testimony to a worldwide water deluge. A faith in time which proves only to promote degradation in the absence of mind, and faith in a reductionism that ends up reducing the materialistic arguments to zero and forcing the need to invoke a supernatural creator." Wow, I like that. The Christian account of creation as found in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 were not intended to be a science textbook on the origin of life, folks. The first 2 chapters in Genesis are intended to show that life came about from nothing by the divine action of a God who creates by the power of his spoken word. Exactly what chemical and scientific processes that were involved in God's work are simply not provided to us. Young Earth, old Earth, or somewhere in between, this can be argued, but it's not the point. The point is we humans were created in the image of God, unlike any other creature or thing that God had made. We're told that the ultimate image of God is to be found in Jesus the Christ, 2 Corinthians 4:3. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, so that they may not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. The Apostle Paul also makes a clear connection between the first man, Adam, and Jesus Christ, the second or last Adam, in terms of being humanity's federal head or representative. 1 Corinthians 15:45. So also it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. All that to say, as far as I'm concerned, dogmatically asserting that bacteria is your first parent takes even more faith than believing the Genesis account. Now, don't think for a minute I'm going to let Bill O'Reilly off the hook here either, because he makes some really goofy statements as well.
Some of them are Aztec myths, they're ancient Egyptian myths, Greek myths,
Whatever.
Judeo-Christian
Don't play
myths.
these semantic games with me. You know what you're doing. You're trying to get to the kids and say, hey, you're an idiot if you believe in God.
It's nothing to do with God. I'm talking about myths from all over the world. The Judeo-Christian myth is thrown in occasionally as one of many myths that come from around the world.
The Judeo-Christian philosophy isn't a myth. It's reality. This country was based on it.
Now, I can't really make out what Dawkins said there. It sounded like Siwa, but maybe he was trying to do a say what? And I would have too. That the founders of the United States were deists or Christians has nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity not being a myth and rather being reality. And point of clarification, Bill, Christianity is not a philosophy. It's a set of truth claims about the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The Old Testament pointing to the promise of his coming, and the New Testament showing him to be the fulfillment of those promises.
Well, that's not true.
Yes, it is. Throughout history, some of the worst regimes ever have been atheistic. You know that. Communists under Stalin, Mao Zedong.
Nothing to do with atheism.
No?
Okay, wait a minute. What do political leaders who were atheists and did horrific things to their people have to do with Dawkins' book? Bill has just shifted the conversation away from whether or not Dawkins is dismissing God and promoting evolution as fact, to Christianity being true because our nation was founded on moral principles that Christianity actually shares with many other religions. Bill, as a Christian, you are blowing it here.
See, my hypothesis is that religion is a constraint on society. Goodwill toward men, treating everybody as Jesus taught, the same as you, how you would like to be treated, the Ten Commandments, they're constraints against bad behavior.
Which of the Ten Commandments do you value?
All of them.
Thou shalt not make a graven image. Thou shalt not violate the Sabbath.
Now, it is true that one of the uses of the moral law, the Ten Commandments, is to restrain society from being as bad as it possibly can be. This is why we have governments and law courts and policemen. But the Ten Commandments are primarily used in the Bible as a mirror to show us our sin and inability to keep God's law, including having no other gods, but the only true God, by worshiping idols of our own making, and by not giving God one day in 7 to worship and meditate on him and his goodness to us and to rest, enjoy him. Now again, how did we get here from the content of Dawkins' book?
Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear
Thou shalt not
false
kill
witness.
is a widespread belief all over the world. It's
Not
nothing
by
to do with the
Pol
Ten
Pot or Mao Zedong
Well,
or
of course
Joseph
not. They're
Stalin.
very-
They all had one thing in common. They didn't believe in God.
Guys, the commandment is you shall not murder. Again, how did we get here?
What I do think is that there is a logical connection between believing in God and sometimes doing evil things.
Sometimes, absolutely. You see that in the Holy War, the Jihad.
Yes, indeed. But there's no logical connection between being atheist and doing evil things.
Well, since you brought it up, Richard, there is a connection in both cases. People, whether religious or atheistic, are born in a sinful condition. People do evil because they are sinful. Some people do more sinful things than others, but we all break the commands of God, sometimes in thought, sometimes in word, and sometimes in deed. People who commit evil in the name of God are not different from people who do evil things not believing in a God at all. The first group does them wrongly thinking they are doing God's will. The second group does them because they wrongly think that they are not accountable to anyone but themselves.
It's just incidentally true that, say, Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin happened to be atheists, but that wasn't what drove them. What drove them was a political ideology that had nothing to do with atheism.
But again, I come back to the constraining influence of religion.
Bill is a Roman Catholic, but he's talking like a universalist. Morality, ethics, and social order is not what Christianity is about, Bill. Now, here's what I mean. I slowed this next clip down so you can see it clearly. And I want you to notice that some well-meaning, and I assume Christian person, baptized the clip I used here in the intro to make it sound like Bill is only talking about Jesus. But that's not correct. Now watch for this edit that he did.
If you believe in the teachings of Jesus, who wants people to be peaceful and to love each other.
Now here is what Bill really said.
If you believe in the teachings of Jesus or Buddha or someone like that, who wants people to be peaceful and to love each other, that is a good thing.
Yeah, but what's that got to do with the origin of the moon?
Now I'm with Dawkins here. What does the teaching of Jesus or Buddha have to do with the origin of the moon? Indeed.
Because I don't believe a meteor crashed into the earth and made everything happen. I think intelligent design made everything happen.
So I guess Bill is saying that since he believes that some kind of intelligence created everything, and this intelligence is what is worshipped by all religious people, and that means that Dawkins is wrong to mock God in his book because Stalin was an atheist, and religion provides a restraining of evil that atheism does not, I think, oh goodness sakes, talk about conversational mission creep. All I can say about Bill O'Reilly is that he really needs to better understand what the Bible he says he believes in is all about. Now, okay, let's wrap this up. Here is Dawkins in the promo for his book explaining different kinds of magic.
There's supernatural magic, like when a fairy godmother turns a pumpkin into a coach. There's conjuring stage magic, like when a stage magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat. And there's the magic of reality, which is the sort of magic you get when you look up at the stars, when you look up at the Milky Way, when you look down a microscope and say, this is magical.
Now let's look at those in reverse order. That last kind of magic is found right in the Bible. The psalmist says, when I consider your heavens, Lord, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars which you have made, what is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? For you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You make him ruler over the works of your hands. You've put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. The only difference is that the psalmist attributes this kind of metaphorical magic to an infinite personal God, and Dawkins attributes it to an eternally existing space dust material and extremely low probabilities that the space dust became the world we now know. Dawkins and I both agree on the second kind of magic. It's sleight of hand that only appears as magic. But the first kind of magic, supernatural magic, well, this needs clarification. Indeed, fairy tale magic is one thing, like magic beans that grow into a beanstalk or a frog turning into a prince. But that kind of stuff is not the same as the magic, well, it's actually called signs and wonders, that we find in the Bible. The Christian claim is that God is sovereign over all that He's made. He created it, and He continues to govern what He has made. God has decreed all things that come to pass in exactly the way that He has ordained them. We call this the first cause of all things. However, the Bible teaches that God uses what's called secondary causes as well. Even the sinful actions of men, by the way. God is always at work upholding what He has made. Signs and wonders, or mighty works, as they're called in the Bible, are nothing more than God working to accomplish His will through means that to mere men are extraordinary and astounding. They are intended to point to the reality of God and His message, and at the same time further frustrate the minds of unbelievers. An example of this is Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. This wonder is a sign that Jesus has power even over death. Now in John 12, we have Jesus eating with Lazarus after He has raised him from the dead. Now you would think that everyone who knew about this would turn in faith to Jesus, but that's not what happened. Here's what we read there. A large crowd of the Jews then learned that He was there, and they came, not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom He raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. That's the epitome of unbelief. You see, the miracles of Jesus were intended to display His power over nature and disease, over demonic influence, over death itself, and to testify to His credentials of being the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. This is the truth claim of Christianity. And Jesus commissioned His disciples to relate this message of who He is to the world, which has been accomplished ultimately through the written documents of the New Testament. The Apostle John wrote this: "What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. And this life was manifested, and we have seen and testify and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also, so that you as well may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ." And the Apostle Peter wrote this: "For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of His majesty. For when He received honor and glory from God the Father, such an utterance as this was made by Him by the majestic glory, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.' And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with Him on the holy mountain." Peter is referring to the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus momentarily revealed His true glory. You see, Christianity is not fairy tale or myth. It is not a philosophy. Unlike any other religion, it's based on the claim that God Himself came among sinful humanity, having taken on humanity to Himself in the person of Jesus Christ. He came as King, not to be served, but to serve and ultimately to die in order to save His people from their sins. And His people are comprised of every tribe and every nation and every tongue, every person who will trust in Him to be saved from their sin and inability to keep the moral law. Christianity is firmly grounded in human history and evidenced by eyewitness accounts. That, my friends, is the magic of Christianity.